In this video, we're going to explore the question, are method parameters really variables? I've referred to them as variables several times, but I don't seem to have ever changed them. Is it a good idea to change the value of a method parameter? What are some of the common mistakes people make with parameters? And a special super bonus topic, I'm going to talk about some ways that you can shorten up complicated if-else statements if you're just choosing between two values. So the method that I want to use to explore this idea about method parameters is a slight variation on the maximum method that we've been working on so far. The method that takes an array of decimals and it gives you back the maximum element in it. I want to make a slight tweak to that. I want to make a new method. I'm going to call it maximum or default. And this thing is going to compute the maximum element of an array of decimals or a default value. If the array contains no element larger than the default value, then we will use the default value as the maximum. Right? That may seem like a little bit of an odd method, but these things come up all the time in language integrated query and that kind of thing. So basically we're saying we want to pass in a number, 100. Right? If there is an element in the array that is larger than 100, then give us that. Otherwise, give us back 100. What are the inputs? Well, the array of decimals and the default value that we're going to use as the maximum if we can't find an element that's larger than it. What's the output? Well, this time I'm going to include some of the language of postconditions in these outputs. I'm going to say a decimal value that's in the array, it's greater than or equal to every other element in the array, or I'm going to give you back the default value. No side effects, as usual. The array must not be null. Now, I've removed the error condition that the array must not be empty, because if the array is not empty, then we can simply hand back the default value. Right? Now we have something that is sensible. We can say, well, there was no element in the array that was larger than this default value, so you must want the default value. All right. So the reason I'm doing this is to illustrate a way to write this code that kind of is abusive of method parameters. So here we have our method. It's a static method. It returns a decimal. It's called maximum or default. It takes two arguments. The parameters are the values and the default value. And we do the thing that we've always done. We say, well, if the values array is equal to null, then we throw an exception. OK, great. So now we can run this loop with the confidence that the array is non-null. It refers to a valid array. It might be an empty array, but it's at least a valid array. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to say for every item in the array, we will run this loop body. If the item is greater than the default value, we'll say the default value is equal to the item. We keep on running through this thing. And then when we're done, the default value is either the largest value in the array because there was an item that was bigger than it, right? Or there was no item that was bigger than it, and it's still the default value. Right? Now, this code is correct. I'll just tell you right now that it's correct. But it is super hard to reason about. The reason it's hard to understand is because this variable, default value, which genuinely is a variable, we can change it, we just did, now has two meanings. Right? It means both what was the value that was passed in and what is the largest value that I've seen so far. And in case you don't believe me, I'm just going to run this code. I've created a tiny little test case here. Right? I've got an array that has two values in it, 10 and 9. And I'm going to call maximum or default. I'm going to pass in that values array and the number 0. Right, so let's see what happens here. We'll step into that. All right, we've entered maximum or default. The values array refers to an array that has two elements, 10 and 9. The default value is 0. So we're going to go through every item in the array. All right, the first item in the array is 10. That is greater than the default value. So we're going to enter the consequence of the if. And now we are going to change the default value from 0 to 10. It's a variable. We can change its value. Right? And now this is 10.0. We go through this again. Right? Item is now 9. Default value is 10. Right? That is, the condition is not met. So we skip the consequence. And we're done. We're going to return the default value, which is 10. And this gives us the correct answer, right? 10 is the maximum element in this array, and it is larger than the default value of 0. So we're good here, right? Now you notice I didn't put in any debug assertions that verify the post conditions and that kind of thing. That's not the point of this method. The point of this method is this is super hard to reason about. Right, because the default value variable, this parameter here, is now doing double duty. I'm using it to mean two very different things. The first thing I'm using it to mean is what is the default value that I would like to use if there is nothing larger than it in the array. And the second thing that I'm using it to mean is what's the biggest thing that I've seen so far. Right? Essentially, what I'm doing here is I'm saying the default value variable, right, is taking over the biggest so far variable that I used before. Right? So this is bad, one, because it makes the code hard to reason about. Right? But another reason it's bad is because it makes the stack window actually lie. Right? If we look at this thing here, I'll see if I can make this window a little bit bigger. Right? You can see it now says that when this method was called, there were two parameters. The values parameter was a array with 2 decimals in it, and the second parameter was a default value which was equal to 10. But we know that it wasn't 10, right? The stack window is telling you the state of the world as it is right now. As it is right now, default value is a variable. It's equal to 10. But when you're looking at the stack window, you would kind of like to know, well, what was the thing like when it was called? When it was called, it was 0. Right? So this is a really, really bad way to write the code. Right? The much preferred way to write the code would be, there's a couple different things we could do. One is we could say decimal biggest so far is equal to the default value. Right? And now never mutate default value. Now just mutate biggest so far. So this is a tiny little variation on our maximum method. Right? And now, when we're debugging this, the default value variable never changes. So the stack window is never lying to you. The variable biggest so far is genuinely telling you what's the biggest thing we've seen so far. If the biggest thing we've seen so far is the default value, great. That's the thing that we're going to return. Right? So this is a much better way to write this code. An even better way to write this code, if we already have our maximum method written, is to simply get rid of all of this, right? Check the values to see if it's null, right? And then say if values.length is equal to 0, then return default value. If we were not given any values, the values array was empty, then clearly we have to return the default value. Right? Now, suppose that it is not empty. Well, then we could say return maximum values. Right? Is this correct? Not quite, right? Because suppose the largest value in values was smaller than the default value. So this isn't quite right. But we could say decimal biggest in values is equal to that, right? And now we can say if biggest in values is greater than default value, return biggest in values, else return default value. All right. And now our code is correct. So what's going to happen here? Well, we enter the method. We have our values array. We have our default value. If the array is of length 0, we already know what we need to do. Otherwise, now we know that the preconditions of maximum are met. We know that the length of the array is not 0, and we know that it is not null. So we can call maximum. We know that we're going to get the biggest value back from it. And now we can say, well, is that bigger than the default value? If it is, then return it. Otherwise, return the default value. And there we go. Now, this code here, this pattern is actually very common, where you want to pick one of two values on the basis of a condition. And there's a special operator in C# for that. It's called the conditional operator. It's sometimes called the ternary operator, because it is the only operator in C# that takes 3 operands. Every other operator takes either 1 or 2 operands, the unary operators and the binary operators. It's also sometimes called the tertiary operator, which is not correct at all. Tertiary means the third most important. Ternary means takes 3 things. The correct name for the thing is the conditional operator, and so that's what I would prefer everybody to call it. So the conditional operator takes 3 operands, and it has the syntax. First, it has a Boolean condition. Then it has a question mark. Then it has a consequence, which is an expression. Then it has a colon. And then it has an alternative. And if these names seem like they come directly out of the syntax for the if statement, that's because they do. This is essentially a very compact version of the if. Now, the consequence and the alternative expressions should be of the same type. Strictly speaking, they don't have to be of the same type. There are some kind of tricky rules in C# for working out what to do if they are not the same type. But one of the most common questions that I see on Stack Overflow is, I have this conditional operator. The compiler is telling me the conditional operator operands are not of the same type. What do I do to fix it? Well, you rewrite the code so that they're of the same type. The language requires that there be a type that it can infer for the value of the condition operator. And so best bet is to just make sure that they're of the same type. And in our case here, they're both going to be decimal. Right? So let's see how we could use this condition operator in our program here. And so instead of this statement, right, this group of statements here that says, well, if this condition is met, then return this value, otherwise return this value, we can write that much more concisely. We can just say return, well, what value do I want to return? Well, the condition that I want to check is biggest in values is greater than default value. Right? If that condition is met, right, so we'll put the question mark there, and then the consequence is going to follow it. Well, I want biggest in values. Otherwise, a colon, I want the default value, and a semicolon. Now I can get rid of all of this. Right. So I like to put parentheses around the condition because I find that it gets a little bit hard to read if it's like this. It's a little bit hard to just parse out with your mind's eye, try to figure out exactly where does the question mark go in here. Is this biggest in values is greater than, and then this thing? Well, this isn't even a binary value. So because that's a little bit tricky, I always recommend that people put in parentheses even when they're not necessary, if it makes the code easier to read. So I like to do that. I like to say I'll have the condition in parentheses, and then if the consequence and the alternative are also complicated expressions, then I'll typically put them in parentheses as well. Now, one final thing that I wanted to mention before we finish off this video about parameters is you notice how we have this method, maximum or default. It takes a parameter called values, right, and also a parameter called default value. And then it calls a method called maximum and passes in this values array. Here's a little trick for you. This is a nice little productivity feature. I double-clicked on maximum. If I now hit F12, I go directly to its definition. That's a really nice, fast way to navigate around the code. This guy also has a parameter called values. Right? So if we trace into this thing, and let's see what happens. Right? We're going to create a local variable called values here. We're going to pass it to maximum or default. Right? That copies it into a parameter called values. We're going to then call maximum on this thing. And this copies it into another parameter called values. Right? It is perfectly legal in C# to have many methods that have parameters that have all the same names, right? And it's actually quite common. And it can get quite confusing. And so this is yet another reason to not modify your parameters. Because if you have a variable called values, you pass it in as a parameter called values, you then change that parameter, right? Well, now you have two variables on the call stack, essentially, right? If we go back and forth between these, you can see that in each case, when we select the different frame on the call stack here, we always have a variable called values that's in scope, right? It would be nice if those were all the same thing and not changing all over the place all the time, right? It is not, of course, legal to have two parameters both called values. I can't have another parameter in here. Values, right? That's an error. That will immediately get a squiggly saying the parameter named values is a duplicate. One of the more straightforward error messages in C#. But there's nothing wrong at all with having many methods that all have parameters that have the same name, and it can get a little bit confusing. Summing up, parameters are variables, but it's best to treat them as values. It's very confusing if you start writing two parameters. Local variable names and parameter names can be duplicated in other methods. They can be local variables or parameters of other methods, so be careful. One of the reasons why local variables are called local variables is because their names are associated locally. They're associated with a specific method, and so they can be duplicated in different methods. And use the conditional operator if it's appropriate to do so. Sometimes an if-else block is easier to read, particularly if the logic is complicated, if there are many nested ifs. You can nest your conditional operators the same way you can nest your ifs, and those get really hard to read. Anytime I see that, I strongly encourage people to just simply rewrite it as an if, then else that you can step through in the debugger.